What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a morning show set, only to face disrespect, condescension, and questions so insulting they shatter the entire interview? In just 33 seconds of one dismissive comment, George Stephanopoulos would turn what should have been a pleasant conversation into one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. Laurence Fishburne arrived at the Good Morning America studio that morning with nothing but good intentions. He was there to talk about his latest project, a passion piece he had been working on for years. The legendary actor, known for his iconic roles and his dignified presence both on and off screen, settled into the guest chair with his usual calm professionalism. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and George Stephanopoulos sat across from him with his notes prepared. The interview started normally enough. George opened with a smile and said, "Laurence Fishburne, welcome to Good Morning America." Laurence nodded graciously and replied, "Thank you for having me, George. It's great to be here." But within moments, something felt off. George's tone carried an edge, a subtle condescension that Laurence immediately picked up on. Instead of asking about the project Laurence was there to promote, George leaned back in his chair and said, "So, Laurence, let's talk about The Matrix. That was quite some time ago, wasn't it? Do you ever worry that your best work is behind you?" The question landed like a slap. Laurence kept his composure, though his expression tightened slightly. He responded with measured professionalism. "Well, George, I'm actually here to discuss my new film, which I'm incredibly proud of. It represents some of my most meaningful work to date." George barely acknowledged the response. He glanced down at his notes and continued, Right, but I think our viewers are more interested in the past. You know, the roles that actually mattered. The Matrix. What's eating Gilbert Grape? Oh wait, that wasn't you, was it?" The confusion was deliberate, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Lawrence's jaw tightened, but he maintained his dignity. "No, George, that was not me, and I'd appreciate it if we could focus on why I'm actually here today." George smirked, a look that suggested he was enjoying himself. Of course. But you have to admit, Laurence, it must be difficult being mistaken for other actors. I mean, it happens to you quite a bit, doesn't it?" The implication was clear and offensive. Laurence leaned forward slightly, his voice still controlled but firmer now. "George, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but I came on this show in good faith to talk about my work. If you're not interested in having that conversation, then perhaps we should end this now." Instead of backing down or apologizing, George doubled down. His smile faded into something colder, more calculating. "Oh, come on, Laurence. Don't be so sensitive. I'm just asking questions our audience wants answered. You're a public figure. You should be able to handle a little scrutiny." "Scrutiny is one thing," Laurence replied, his voice steady but his eyes burning with restrained frustration. "Disrespect is another. There's a difference between journalism and whatever this is." George leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression now openly antagonistic. "You know what I think, Laurence? I think you're not used to being challenged. You've been coddled by Hollywood for so long that you can't handle a real interview. You come on these shows expecting everyone to just praise you and ask softball questions." The studio fell silent. The crew members exchanged uncomfortable glances. This had gone far beyond normal interview territory. Laurence took a deep breath, clearly working to maintain his composure in the face of such blatant hostility. "George," Laurence said slowly, "I've done hundreds of the interviews over my career. I've answered tough questions about my craft, my choices, my life. What you're doing right now isn't tough journalism, it's just rude." George laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Rude? I'm being rude? You're sitting here in our studio, on our time, and you're lecturing me about rudeness? That's rich." "I'm sitting here because I was invited," Laurence countered, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "I cleared my schedule, I came to your studio, and I expected a basic level of professional respect. That's not entitlement, George. That's just common decency." George's face flushed red. He clearly didn't like being called out, especially not on his own show. Common decency? Let me tell you about common decency, Laurence. Common decency is showing up prepared to answer any question, not just the ones you like. Common decency is understanding that when you're promoting something, you don't get to control the entire conversation. "I'm not trying to control anything," Laurence said, his patience visibly wearing thin. "I'm simply asking to be treated with respect. Why is that so difficult for you?" George stood up abruptly, his microphone nearly falling from his lapel. You want to know what's difficult? What's difficult is sitting here with someone who thinks they're above the process. You actors come in here all the time with your egos and your demands, thinking you're doing us a favor just by showing up. Laurence remained seated, but his posture was rigid, his hands gripped tightly on the armrests of his chair. I never said I was above anything, but I will not sit here and be insulted on national television for your entertainment or your ego. My ego? George shot back, his voice now loud enough that it echoed slightly in the studio. This isn't about my ego. This is about you not being able to handle basic questions. What are you so afraid of, Laurence? That people might see you're not as perfect as you pretend to be? The accusation was absurd and clearly designed to provoke. Laurence shook his head slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. You know what, George? I actually feel sorry for you. You're sitting here, hosting one of the biggest morning shows in America, and instead of using this platform to have meaningful conversations, you're using it to tear people down. That says a lot more about you than it does about me. George's face went from red to nearly purple. Don't you dare psychoanalyze me. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Laurence replied quietly. I know that a good interviewer lifts their guests up, creates space for real dialogue, and treats people with humanity. You're doing none of those things. George pointed his finger directly at Laurence, his hand shaking slightly with anger. You need to remember where you are right now. This is my show, my set, my rules. If you don't like how I conduct interviews, there's the door. Laurence looked at the finger pointing at him, then back up at George's face. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable weight. You know what, George? I think I'll take you up on that. The room seemed to freeze. No one expected Laurence to actually leave. George certainly didn't. His pointing finger lowered slightly, confusion flickering across his angry features. What? George said. Laurence stood up slowly, carefully removing his microphone and placing it on the chair. I said I'm leaving. I came here in good faith, and you've made it clear that you have no interest in a respectful conversation. I don't need this, and I certainly don't need to subject myself to your hostility. George's mouth opened and closed. For a moment, he seemed genuinely stunned. Then the anger returned, stronger than before. You can't just walk off my show. We're live. Watch me, Laurence said simply. If you walk off this set right now, George said, his voice taking on a threatening tone, I will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I'll tell them how you couldn't handle a few simple questions, how you ran away the moment things got slightly difficult. Laurence paused, turning back to face George directly. The look on his face was one of complete calm, a stark contrast to George's barely contained rage. George, you can say whatever you want about me. You can spin this however makes you feel better. But everyone watching, everyone in this studio, they all saw what just happened here. They saw you attack a guest for no reason. They saw you turn a simple interview into a personal vendetta. You don't need me to make you look bad. You've done that all by yourself. George took a step toward Laurence, his fists clenched at his sides. You arrogant, self-righteous. Careful, George, Laurence interrupted, his voice still remarkably steady. You're still on camera. Do you really want America to see you completely lose control? The reminder seemed to hit George like cold water. He glanced toward the cameras, suddenly aware that every word, every gesture was being broadcast. His jaw worked silently as he struggled to regain his composure. Laurence didn't wait for a response. He turned and began walking toward the exit. A producer rushed forward, trying to intercept him. Mr. Fishburne, please, we can work this out. Just give us a moment. Laurence shook his head politely but firmly. I appreciate that, but no, I won't be disrespected like this. Not by him, not by anyone. George found his voice again, shouting across the studio. This is unbelievable. You're walking off because you can't handle the heat? This is pathetic. Laurence stopped at the studio door and turned one last time. His voice carried clearly across the space. No, George. What's pathetic is a grown man who has to tear others down to feel important. What's pathetic is using your position of power to bully guests who come here in good faith. I genuinely hope you take some time to reflect on why you felt the need to treat me this way. Because this isn't journalism. This isn't even good television. This is just sad. Get out, George screamed, his face contorted with rage. Get out of my studio. I'm already leaving, Laurence said calmly. You don't need to tell me twice. As Laurence reached for the door handle, George made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "You're finished. Do you hear me? You'll never work in this town again after this stunt." Laurence actually laughed, a genuine sound of disbelief. "George, I've been working in this industry for decades. I've built a career on integrity and professionalism. You really think one angry host is going to change that? You're not as important as you think you are." The words hit their mark. George stood frozen in the middle of the studio, his mouth hanging open, unable to form a response. The crew members stared at their feet, embarrassed to witness their host's complete meltdown. Laurence opened the door, the morning light from the hallway spilling into the studio. Before stepping through, he offered one last observation. "You know what the saddest part of all this is, George? I actually used to respect you. I thought you were a serious journalist, someone who cared about truth and meaningful discourse. But today, you showed me who you really are, and I have to say, it's disappointing." "I don't need your respect," George spat back, though his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. He sounded defensive now, almost wounded. "Clearly," Laurence agreed, "but you should need your own. You should be able to look at yourself at the end of the day and be proud of how you treated people. Can you honestly say that about today?" George didn't answer. He couldn't. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Laurence nodded slowly, as if George's silence confirmed everything he needed to know. "That's what I thought. Goodbye, George. I hope your ratings were worth it." With that, Laurence Fishburne walked out of the Good Morning America studio, leaving behind a host whose face was red with humiliation and anger, a crew that looked anywhere but at their boss, and cameras that had captured every second of the spectacular implosion. George stood in the middle of the set, breathing heavily, his carefully crafted image of the controlled professional journalist shattered completely. A stage manager tentatively approached him. "George, we need to go to commercial." George waved him away dismissively, still staring at the door through which Laurence had exited. Just do it." Cut to commercial. As the studio lights dimmed and the live broadcast cut away, George finally seemed to realize the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had invited a respected actor onto his show and, through his own hostility and arrogance, had created a disaster. He had pushed and pushed, expecting Laurence to back down, to accept the disrespect, to play along. Instead, Laurence had done something George never anticipated. He had simply refused to participate. The producer who had tried to stop Laurence approached George cautiously. "George, what happened?" George spun on him, his anger finding a new target. "What happened? What happened is that prima donna couldn't handle a real interview. He walked off because he's too sensitive." But even as the words left his mouth, George knew how hollow they sounded. Everyone in that studio had witnessed the same thing. They had seen George attack an invited guest without provocation. They had seen him escalate at every opportunity. They had seen him lose control completely. The makeup artist who had been preparing the next guest spoke up quietly, almost to herself. He just asked to talk about his film. That's all he wanted. George heard her and whirled around. "What did you say?" The makeup artist looked terrified but stood her ground. "Mr. Fishburne, he just wanted to discuss his new project. That's why he was booked. And you didn't let him." The simple truth of her statement seemed to deflate something in George. His shoulders sagged slightly, but pride wouldn't let him admit fault. Not yet, not in front of his team. He could have handled it better. He chose to make a scene. A cameraman, emboldened by the makeup artist's honesty, spoke up. "With respect, George, you were the one yelling." He stayed calm the whole time. He just left. George looked around at his crew, seeing the truth reflected in their faces. They weren't on his side. They couldn't be, because they had all seen what really happened. The realization seemed to hit him hard. "Everyone back to work," George said tersely. "We have a show to finish." The crew scattered, but the atmosphere remained tense. George returned to his chair, sitting down heavily. He stared at the empty guest chair across from him, the microphone still lying where Laurence had carefully placed it. The image of Laurence's calm dignity in the face of his aggression played over and over in George's mind. Every insult he had thrown, every dismissive comment, every attempt to belittle and provoke, Laurence had met it all with composure and grace. And in the end, when it became clear that respect wasn't on the table, Laurence had simply chosen not to play the game. George had expected many things from that interview. He had expected to rattle Laurence, to get some viral moment, to prove his own relevance as a hard-hitting interviewer. What he hadn't expected was to be the one left looking small. He hadn't expected to be the one whose behavior would be questioned. He hadn't expected Laurence Fishburne to have the strength to just walk away. The floor director's voice crackled through his earpiece. 30 seconds to live. George straightened his tie, checked his appearance in the monitor, and prepared to continue the show as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something significant. And no amount of spin or deflection could change the fact that millions of viewers had just watched him completely lose control. The camera light turned red, signaling they were back on air. George smiled his professional smile and began reading from the teleprompter, moving on to the next segment as smoothly as possible. But his hands trembled slightly as he held his notes, and his voice lacked its usual confidence. Meanwhile, somewhere outside the studio, Laurence Fishburne walked through the building's exit and into the morning air. His publicist rushed to catch up with him, phone already in hand, undoubtedly fielding calls and messages about what had just transpired. "Laurence," his publicist began, slightly out of breath. "That was necessary," Laurence finished calmly. "That was necessary. The phones are already ringing off the hook. Everyone wants a statement." Laurence stopped walking and turned to face his publicist. "Then here's my statement. I went on that show to discuss my work. I was met with disrespect and hostility. I chose not to accept that treatment. That's all anyone needs to know." "But George is. George is a bully who finally pushed someone who pushed back," Laurence said firmly, "and I'm not going to apologize for having self-respect." His publicist nodded slowly, a small smile forming. "Okay, I can work with that." As they walked toward the waiting car, Laurence felt no regret about his decision. He had spent too many years, worked too hard, and earned too much respect to sit quietly while someone tried to humiliate him for ratings. Some battles weren't worth fighting, but some lines couldn't be crossed without consequence. Back in the studio, George continued through the rest of the show, but the energy had shifted. Every smile felt forced, every transition awkward. The remaining guests seemed wary, their publicists likely having seen what happened and warning them to tread carefully. The crew worked efficiently, but without their usual warmth toward their host. When the show finally ended and the cameras stopped rolling, George retreated to his dressing room without speaking to anyone. He closed the door, loosened his tie, and sat down heavily on the couch. The events of the morning played through his mind on an endless loop. Every moment he could have de-escalated, he had chosen to escalate instead. Every opportunity to show grace, he had shown arrogance. And Laurence Fishburne, with his quiet dignity and firm boundaries, had exposed every one of George's flaws for millions to see. The knock on his dressing room door was tentative. "George, the executive producer needs to speak with you." George closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew this conversation was coming. How could it not? But knowing didn't make it any easier. "Tell him I'll be right there," George called out, his voice sounding tired even to his own ears. As he stood and checked his reflection one more time, George Stephanopoulos realized that in trying to diminish Laurence Fishburne, he had only diminished himself. The actor had walked away from the interview with his dignity intact, his reputation enhanced by his refusal to accept mistreatment. George, on the other hand, had revealed something ugly about himself that no amount of damage control could completely erase. The morning had started with such promise: a respected guest, a live audience, the potential for compelling television. Instead, George had created a spectacle for all the wrong reasons. He had let his ego, his need for control, his inexplicable hostility toward his guest turn what should have been a pleasant conversation into a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the importance of treating people with basic human decency. And the worst part, the part that George was only beginning to understand as he prepared to face his producers, was that he had no one to blame but himself.